When we think about community-based services for people with disabilities, our thoughts are first, of course, drawn to the tremendous increase in opportunities that were afforded to people with developmental disabilities. As services in the community grew, individuals had a tremendous range of opportunities that they had never had before when they were in institutional settings. What's less obvious is the tremendous growth of this new industry that evolved as a result of people living in the community. The purpose of this presentation is to share a little bit of the perspective of what it is that created this evolution of the industry related to people who work in disability services. Throughout the first half of the 1900s, it was almost a given that people with disabilities would be placed in institutional settings. If you look at the data of enrollment in institutions, there's this steady increase that we see happening. In the late 50s and early 60s, you start to get some inclination that things are changing. Parent groups started to form, and private schools for individuals or children with disabilities were started. Private schools like Winifred Stewart, the Christine Meikle School, Emily Follansbee were parent-based schools that evolved in order to provide educational opportunities for children with disabilities. It wasn't until 1968 that we start to see a very rapid decline in the enrollment of people in institutions across North America. This was completely universal. It happened in Alberta, it happened in Canada, it happened in the United States, as at 1968 was really the tipping point as far as the development of community services. I've already alluded to the first reason why this took place, and that was the growth of the parent movement. Parents were going to institutions, checking them out and saying, this isn't for us. I can tell you that in the case of the Robin Hood Association, the Cormacks, Colonel Eric Cormack and his wife Barbara, who were our founders, were told when George was born that the best thing they could do was take him to an institution and forget about him. And when George was 6, they did visit Michener Center in Red Deer, and they very quickly came to the conclusion that that was not what they wanted for their son. Ultimately, they got involved with the Winifred Stewart School, and then later on, they started the Robin Hood School in Sherwood Park. Second major factor that contributed to the rise of the community-based movement was John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Now, it happened that the Kennedys had, or John Kennedy had a sister by the name of Rosemary, and she had a developmental disability, and she was in an institution in the United States. John Kennedy's parents started a foundation whose purpose was to research developmental disability and improve conditions for people with developmental disabilities. And they put one of their other daughters, Eunice Kennedy Shriver, in charge of that foundation. She worked very diligently at supporting this foundation, and it is interesting to note that she is also the founder of the whole Special Olympics movement that has played such a big role in the lives of so many people with disabilities. When John was elected as president in 1961, she encouraged him to make disabilities a very important part of his mandate as the President of the United States. President Kennedy responded by appointing a 27-member Blue Ribbon panel consisting of prominent scientists, doctors, and others to research disability services and to develop a plan to improve conditions for people with disabilities. when they came back with their over 100 recommendations, included in those recommendations, was that institutions be replaced by community-based agencies. A third important factor that contributed to the growth of community-based services was the literature that was being produced. Authors like Bent Niger and Wolf Wolfensberger were writing primarily to the academic community and delivering lectures, providing a rationale for why we needed to provide better services, a more normal lifestyle for individuals with disabilities. And so that had a big impact as well on people becoming aware of conditions in institutions and the importance of a more normative lifestyle for those individuals. Finally, there was a young investigative journalist by the name of Geraldo Rivera that sneaked a movie camera, into a institution by the name of Willowbrook State School in upstate New York, and he took pictures of the conditions in that institution. And most of you will probably have seen some of those images of large, overcrowded, understimulated, simply hellholes that individuals were residing in. And when he put that video out into the media, there was a very strong public reaction against the conditions that existed in institutions. And so the movement began, and the industry of people working in this field simply emerged. Little organizations, parent-based typically, would decide to start a school or a workshop or later on a group home, and they would hire whoever was available who cared to work in this field. These were well-intentioned people. They were poorly paid. They didn't have really any training that was specific to the work that they were doing. Certainly no benefits. And there was nobody in charge of this whole human resource evolution. Government didn't take it on. Each organization did whatever they felt they should do in terms of their human resource plan. And so we ended up with incredible wide range of human resource approaches to supporting the staff that worked in disability services. I'll now share a little bit about my involvement and how I got involved in this field. In 1974, I was attending university, completing my degree in education, and we saw an ad in the Edmonton Journal for house parents. And we thought it would be a tremendous opportunity to have free room and board, for one thing, but also to broaden our experience. And so we applied and were hired as the first house parents in a group home for children with multiple disabilities in the province. And since at the end of that year, we were planning to move ahead with our lives. And we were asked, or I was asked, if I would consider staying on and supervising the Robin Hood School, which was a school of some 50 children with severe and multiple disabilities, and the one group home. At that time, private schools were being pressured by Alberta Education to start to employ certified teachers. The majority of the teachers that worked in this sector were simply, again, lay people that had just got involved, didn't have any training, were not certified, and had gotten involved as instructors in these private schools. And since Alberta Education was pressing these associations to employ certified teachers, the Robin Hood Association asked if I would stay on because I was a certified teacher. And since I had a year of experience as a house parent, it was felt that if they ever developed additional group homes, I would have some background in supporting staff that worked in that area. In the early 80s, the University of Alberta, with the assistance of Disability Services, as it's called now, organized a specialized program, a master's level program, to provide instruction for people that were interested in severe and profound disabilities. And I saw that as a great opportunity to broaden my knowledge in this field, and so I enrolled and completed the program. Part of the requirements for the master's degree was to produce a thesis. And because I had a great interest in people that worked in the field of disability services, I decided that I would do my thesis on staff that worked in this field. The title of my thesis was Job Satisfaction and Turnover of Staff in Residential Facilities for Mentally Handicapped Persons in Alberta, and it was published in 1986. And it was the first effort of any kind to try and gather data, demographics, about the people that worked in this field. I gathered information about the demographics, about turnover, and reasons why people remained employed in a field that didn't pay very well and had a great number of challenges associated with it. It was about this same time that I got involved with the Education Committee with an organization called the Alberta Association of Rehabilitation Centres, which is now called the Alberta Council of Disability Services. And we started to conduct or hold conferences. And some of you may recall that we always used the preface initiative and then what the particular conference would focus on for that year. And we started small, but it wasn't long before we had more than 400 people attending each of these conferences. And it was a great coming together of the staff that worked in this field. But it also underlined the divergent ways in which organizations were managing their staff. Job descriptions were different, pay rates were different, job titles were very different, and there was also a great sense of isolation by many of the staff. It was very common for staff to say, I am just a group home worker, or I am just a support worker in this field. And so it was quite clear that we as a field and staff that worked in this field had a very poor image of ourselves. And so we started to talk a little bit about the importance of making this a more legitimate profession, to create some identity that we could take pride in, that we would have some standards in terms of qualifications, that we would have some commonality around job titles, and that we would become a creditable profession. This is a quote from a speech that I gave at an ACDS conference sometime around the beginning of this effort to try and organize the workforce. If you want to influence government, the general public, existing workforce, potential workforce, employers, if you want a qualified, competent, valued workforce, you can either try to achieve that goal with 200 different human resource plans or develop one plan that represents 200 organizations. The answer is obvious, but it is a real challenge given the independent nature of service providers. In the early 90s, the Education Committee of ARC made a presentation to the board of ARC and asked for their blessing for our efforts to try and create a project that would bring us forward in terms of creating this human resource plan for the province. We applied to the federal government and were successful. We got a grant of about $250,000. We formed a committee with representation from across the province. We had post-secondary and government represented. And we were had to select an external chair, so we chose Dale Jocelyn, who had a long and distinguished career in disability services, and we called the project the Community Rehabilitation Careers Project. We did quite a lot of work in that project because we were starting from square one. Nothing existed, and there was a great belief that we were really taking on a remarkably big challenge, and it was. One of the first things we did was a demographic study of the people that worked in disability services. So that gave us two data points. There was my thesis from the mid-80s, and then we had in the mid-90s another set of data describing the characteristics of people that worked in this field. We also developed a job classification system, and I must tell you that when we had these focus groups across the province, there was a great belief that jobs were very unique, that staff that worked in urban settings had very different jobs than staff that worked in rural settings. Staff that worked in residential services were very different than in day programs, and that people that worked in small organizations must have very different jobs than those that worked in large organizations. But as we worked through our descriptors of here's the bundles of work that we do, it became increasingly clear that we were all engaged in doing a lot of very common work with some specializations that occurred. And so we had our functional descriptions of what the nature of the work was, and we then had the job classification, and we had a process for training organizations in how to use those tools. We developed a human resource administration manual. When we started that part of the project, we asked quite a number of organizations if we could have a look at what they were using for a human resource policy manual. Well, some organizations didn't even have one. Some had very, very short, small documents, 5 or 6 pages. The information in some cases was illegal. In some cases it created internal conflict, and it was quite clear that human resource policy manuals were not very sophisticated. So we worked with a lawyer by the name of Robert Watson from Winnipeg, and we worked with Alan Snart with Western Management Consulting Services, and we developed a template of a human resource manual that we made available to every organization in the province, and many organizations use that then as the basis for creating and improving their own human resource manuals. We also created a training and education plan. We spent countless hours identifying the skills that people should have to work in this field, and we used that information then to help create a program called Basic Skills Training. This was a tutor-learner based program. It involved training tutors who would then work with small groups of learners in their own agencies, and we were involved with Alberta Vocational College in getting this educational program launched, and ultimately over 6,000 learners went through the Basic Skills Training program. I said at the time that we developed the Basic Skills program that I hoped that it would be the least training that staff in this field had, and that it wouldn't become the most. Sadly, as I look back years later, for many of our staff, basic skills, or now foundations, is probably the only training that many of our staff will ever receive to work in this field, and that is it's a tragedy because we've lost the majority of our post-secondary programs that prepared many of our key staff for work in this field. So the CRCP program ran through the 90s. At the end of the 1990s, our field was moving towards community boards, and this was a new concept in how governance would be provided to this field. None of us knew what the impact would be. We had hopes that the community boards would take a role in providing leadership for human resource planning in the province, and we advocated to them to take that on. They considered it. They hired two researchers, two uh, people from MacEwan University, Cheryl Crocker and Karen Hislop, who did some work in the field. They traveled around, they did a report, submitted it to government, and that was the end of that story. Nothing transpired, and it became clear in the early 2000s that government was not going to be leading us forward in terms of human resource planning. So CRCP was about the industry trying to lead the human resource plan. The project done by the community boards was strictly government. That went nowhere. And so it was clear that neither the agencies nor government could do this independently. So in 2002, Gail Davies, who was the CEO of ACDS, approached myself and Dr. Alec Hilliard, who's currently the CEO of the Calgary Region Disability Services, if we would co-chair a new initiative called Workforce 2010. And to some extent that was a recreation of the CRCP project, but it was clear that we had more to do in this area. Originally, Workforce 2010 was going to be a 3-year project. It actually stretched out for more than that by quite a lot. And again, this was a committee that was made up of people from across the province. Again, some people from post-secondary, some people from government. And we took on a number of important projects. One was called ProTracker, which was an effort to collect turnover data across the province. We tried to encourage employers to be better employers, a project called Employer of Choice. And again, we did a demographic survey of staff that worked in this field, so we then had those 3 data points. So we could compare, for example, qualifications. And I can tell you that the average qualifications from when I did my thesis in the mid-80s to when we repeated this demographic study in about 2005 was declining, which was really tragic to see. We did a lot of work on marketing and branding. We tried to improve the image of staff that worked in this field. We did work in the area of job classification and job qualifications. Our basic skills program was replaced by a program called Foundations, and to date that program has graduated over 3,000 staff. We also created 6 regional workforces, and we struggled with some regions having enough contact with one another to maintain momentum, but we had some very strong regional workforces that engaged in some very excellent projects. In the South, they did some excellent work in terms of public exposure through the media of work that was done in this field and the staff that worked in this field. Calgary did a great project in terms of going into high schools and encouraging individual students to consider a career in disability services. Red Deer did a great project on some shared training initiatives. In Edmonton, a major project involved a staff job satisfaction project and also some work on cultural diversity. And in the Northeast, there was also a lot of work done on shared training opportunities. Also coming out of the work of our workforce we saw the emergence of the Alberta Disability Workers Association, and over the years we've had a number of key people that worked as project managers, and among those are Maureen Murphy-Black, Yvonne Martyrdom, Wendy Hollow, and a fellow that did a lot of work for us was Brooks Hadowich, and our current project manager is Jim DeRoche. Workforce 2010 eventually became the provincial workforce. In 2014, I resigned as chair of the provincial workforce after 20 years working in this field. On these projects, I felt it was time for some new blood. To me, it's clear that a lot of good work has been done, and that that there are many more people now that share the vision of a provincial workforce. I believe the work done by the Workforce Council was a key part of the recent wage increases that came to the disability services sector, and I think that we have raised our profile considerably and have created a sense of pride amongst many of the staff that work in this field. However, there is still much that needs to be done. We need more organizations to believe and to buy in and to become involved. At times I would get a little discouraged because there was never as many people buying into the concept of a provincial workforce vision as I wanted to have. But then I would remind myself that we're still only in an occupation that's existed for 45 years. We're relatively new. And I would imagine that if we continue to make our efforts through our workforce councils and individuals, if we keep moving forward, that eventually we will gain the recognition and the credibility that the people that work in this field deserve. In order to be successful, I think that our workforce councils need to keep pushing forward. And I do think that ACDS and disability services need to set standards that would require organizations to raise the bar in terms of qualifications for staff that work in this field. Thank you very much.